Welcome back to the Age of Cathedrals. In our last time together, we looked at the basic elements of medieval church building: the crypt, the apse and choir, the nave, the transepts and the transept crossing, as well as some of the architectural innovations of Gothic cathedrals, the thinner walls and replacement of painted interior spaces by stained glass, the overall effect of dazzling height, reaching toward the light, the various types of detached sculpture, the delicate effects of tracery, and the dynamic optical impression of complex and energetic exterior and interior spaces. Today we will address some of the technical issues connected to Gothic buildings in order to ask the question: how was it that the master masons who built Gothic cathedrals managed to build such large and tall structures, and at the same time to make them appear so graceful and so delicate? The first technical innovation of Gothic architecture had to do with the reinforcement of the shafts which support the high, wide ceiling vaults. Some of the pillars under cathedral walls are massively thick, as in this example from Notre Dame in Paris. Notice how massive the pillars are on either side of the nave. Other columns, however, are rendered less obviously massive by the use of what are known as composite piers, shafts, half columns, or pilaster strips which surround a main shaft up to the level of the capital or abacus, from which the large vault might be sprung. Here we see examples of a compound pier in the entrance to the nave of Saint Denis. And here are some early examples from France and England of piers with detached shafts. The free shafts are here pictured in black, the core of the pillar in hatching. The high and wide vaults themselves were reinforced by a system of ribs, which are designed to transfer the weight of the ceiling to precise points and along distinct lines to the top of the columns, which then transfer it internally to the ground. Scholars have debated long and hard about whether the rib is an aesthetic or a functional element of the structure. Yet there is no doubt that the ribbed vault replaced the barrel or tunnel and groined vaults as an essential element of Gothic design. Here, looking up the choir vault of Notre Dame in Paris, we see the new crisscrossed and mutually reinforced system of Gothic ribbing, a feature of style which survives as a style, as in these examples of ribbed vaulting along the ceiling of one of the Yale colleges, even when it is not structurally necessary. The overall structure of Gothic cathedrals was further enhanced by use of broken or pointed arches, as in this example of the west facade of Notre Dame in Paris, or again in this New World rendering on Harkness Bell Tower at Yale. Broken arches, it turns out, tend to be 25 to 30% stronger than the Romanesque rounded arches, or the basket handle arches, which tended over time to sag in the middle, as in this example from Vézelay. Above all, Gothic church architecture is associated with an externalizing of support for its high walls, and this via the flying buttresses which unite the inside and outside of the building in an organic whole, as we can see in this example from the choir of Saint Denis, but which will be more spectacularly realized in, say, Reims, as we see in this image of the exterior of the apse and choir, at Le Mans, at Beauvais, at Chartres, where the flying buttresses make for an incredible sense of structural lightness. This fine example of high Gothic style is angled and denies the Romanesque defensive, stolid, square frontality. If Romanesque building is about mass and weight, Gothic building is about vectors and forces. In this cross-sectional drawing of a flying buttress by the man responsible for the restoration of Gothic cathedrals in the 19th century, Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, we see just how the Gothic buttressing system parries the lateral thrust of the high vault to the ground. The buttress structure is energetic, complex, multi-layered, moving along horizontal and vertical lines, but also diagonally. The use of a tangle of shapes, straight lines, rounded and pointed arches, triangles, squares, rectangles, trapezoids, reveals a space that is both inside and outside of the building, visible to the eye and not. The blue line on our side separates the inside and the outside of the building, with the image of the man dwarfed by the height of the tribune. Dynamic and intricate, the great Gothic wall is not about weight, but about forces. Forces opposed to each other, acting counter to each other, held in balance with each other, to produce a third in counterpoise, which is neither. This takes place where the lateral thrust of the rib ogival vault meets the counter thrust of the flyer, which is the red line. The flyer carries that force to the external medial vertical pier, where it is again met at the optimal point before being transferred to the massive outer buttress, and from there to the ground. Note the use of the pinnacle weight placed on top of the middle vertical pier to stabilize it and to prevent movement and tension in the pier buttress. The upper flyers also function to resist the effects of high winds pressing on the large exposed surface of the clerestory wall and roof at higher elevations, while the lower supports resist the lateral thrust of the vault. Finally, the cathedral builders of the 12th and 13th centuries were able to build as big and high as they did through the use of a bay pattern of construction in modules, as we see in this reconstruction of the original plan of Notre Dame of Laon Cathedral, or of the Cathedral of Sens, or of Chartres. Gothic architecture is synonymous with multiplicity, modular accretion, a grid system, a network, a repetitive all-over pattern. The division of the nave into successive identical units, bays with analytic partitions, each reinforcing the one next to it, meant that the bigger a building was, the stronger it was. This quality of regular modules that can be substituted for each other has also led to the comparison of Gothic architecture with scholastic philosophy, which seeks to find in logic a language into which ideas can be inserted and substituted for one another. Art historian Gottfried Semper remarked that Gothic architecture is scholasticism in stone, an idea most fully elaborated in a book by Erwin Panofsky, Gothic Architecture and Scholastic Philosophy. Gothic architecture was certainly linked to the new science and learning of the period, which we will see most dramatically when we get to our discussion of Chartres, one of the new centers of learning in the 12th and 13th century. Before we end today, however, I would like to share with you an astounding fact. The cathedrals were built without measuring materials. It was all done via proportion. This tomb slab of Hugh Libergier, who died in 1263, and who in 1231 began the construction of the Abbey of Saint-Nicaise in Reims, shows the master builder with a rod, which is not a measuring stick, but was used like a compass to lay out ratios. The great builders thought of themselves as geometricians. Suger claims that Saint-Denis will shine with the beauty of length and width. Moreover, he says, it was cunningly provided that though the upper columns and central arches, which were to be placed upon the lower ones built in the crypt, the central nave of the old nave, should be equalized by means of geometrical and arithmetical instruments with the central nave of the new edition. Here, the influence of Arabic science and mathematics is undeniable. The Arabs had vast knowledge of classical and Indian science. Filtered through the universities of Spain, such knowledge reached France in the 12th century. Adelard of Bath translated the complete works of Euclid at a time when only a few theorems were known in Western Europe. In 1145, Robert Chester translated Al-Khwarizmi's work on algebra, which marked the arrival of the calculating methods of algebra in Europe. In a famous incident in architectural history, the builders of the Cathedral of Milan ran into difficulty and summoned great architects from all over the world in 1391 or 1392. Records of their discussions survive, and they show that there was no contest over the importance of geometric forms in plotting the future design of the cathedral. There was merely debate over whether to use the square, on which the ground plan had already been built, or the equilateral triangle. In their proportionally geometric layout, Gothic cathedrals were assumed to embody divine proportions along the lines that God revealed to Noah for the building of the ark, or to Moses for the building of the Ark of the Covenant, or the proportions revealed to Solomon for the building of the first temple. So too do such proportions have a relation to music and to musical ratios, and this via the concept of Platonic number symbolism. For Augustine, numbers are the thoughts of God. All embodied things exist in proportion and number, he says. And Augustine's perfect ratio, 1 to 2, or the octave, is generally thought to determine a cathedral's elevation, or the relation between the length of the church and the total width of the transept. As we have seen, architecture had an anagogical function, that is to say, to be spiritually uplifting and to provoke movement toward the spiritual world. And it had the purpose of embodying proportion among numbers, with the understanding that the perception of ratios embodies reason and leads to God in his sanctuary, the heavenly city. Numbers guide the mind from perception of things to an invisible truth in God, who is pictured as the architect of the universe, as seen in this miniature from a mid-13th century French Bible. In our next time together, we shall examine the building of what is perhaps the best known Gothic cathedral, Notre Dame in Paris.